There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
And we read about these two different thoughts in Athens. And so now Paul, what he's going to do is he's going to proclaim this unknown God to them, and he's going to proclaim Him as the Creator. And by Paul proclaiming this to the Epicureans, who are atheists, who say that all matter is matter and it's always been matter, they don't believe in creation. And then you have the Stoics there who says that everything is God and God didn't create anything. And Paul is telling them that this unknown God made the world and everything in it. That this God is not a part of His creation. That He's not imprisoned by His creation, that He's distinct from creation, that He's separate from it, where this God is too great to be locked into a temple made by man, where a man couldn't build a temple big enough for Him. And so what Paul is basically saying with his very first sentence is the opposite view of pantheism. So Paul, he's destroying their view of the real God living in any temple or needing any person to serve Him. Where these pagans in Athens, they spent their whole time serving these man-made gods. They were going around giving them food and giving them drinks. That's what they spent their days doing. And so here you got Paul, and he's saying this from the Areopagus, where there's actually 3 shrines to Athena. And then he tells them that this is all foolishness. And then he tells them, instead of man serving the gods, it's really God who serves man. That it's God who is the one who's self-sufficient, where He needs nothing from man, where there's nothing that a man can do in a temple that can add anything to God. But it's God who gives us what we need, and He gives us life and breath. Where God, He not only gives us life, but then He sustains that life. Where the Greeks, they believed that their gods were these distant beings who didn't care a thing about them, that they didn't care anything about any of man's problems. But then Paul goes on to tell them that the unknown God created all men from one flesh, that all people descended from one man, and that all nations, that they share the same blood. Where these Athenians, what they believed they were the master race, and that they were superior to all the races. And they didn't even just think they were better than all the other nations. They believed they were even superior to all the other Greeks, because that's what polytheism believed. They believed that the different races came from different gods. And then Paul tells them that even their precious little Greece was a gift from God, that God had created the nation's boundaries and their histories, and that He pre-appointed times for the rise and the fall of nations. And that God had done all of this in hope that they would seek Him and find Him, because He's not very far away from any of us. So He's not like these gods on Mount Olympus or on some other planet, but that it's only in Him that we live and have our being, that our life isn't independent from God. And then Paul, he quotes 2 other poets. And one of them is Epidemius, who is that guy that offered all those sheep to the unknown God in 600 BC. And then Aratus from 310 BC, where he says, "For we are also His offspring." And Paul here, he's not calling all men the children of God, but he's confirming the fatherhood of God in a natural sense, that all men were created in the image of God, in the sense that Adam was a son of God, and that all their ideas about God are wrong, that God is not like art. He's not like gold or silver or stone. He's not like one of their idols, that their idols, they don't represent God at all. And that it's foolish for man to make gods in man's image, because it was God who made man in his image. Where Paul, he's standing there and he's boldly telling them all that their religion, with all their gods and temples, their idols, with all their rituals, that it's all foolishness. And then he concludes by telling them that God has been patient with man's sin and his ignorance for centuries, and that he's held back his wrath, even though man was guilty, that God overlooked it. And now times are different. And Paul tells them that God is now commanding them to repent. And they actually know what this word means because it's the Greek word metanoia, which means to change your mind. Because God was coming to judge the world in righteousness. And Paul tells them about the man that God ordained to do all this. And that the proof of that this is true is that God raised this man from the dead. And you don't see Paul mentioning Jesus' name here in our text. But we do know that he had already mentioned Jesus because that's why he was called to the Areopagus, because they wanted to hear about Jesus and the resurrection. So this resurrection of the dead, that was a hard idea for these Greeks to accept because they thought of the body of being a prison. And they thought that the sooner you leave your body, the happier you're going to be. And then to raise the body for it to live again, that just didn't sit right with them because they believed in the immortality of the soul and they did believe in an afterlife, but they didn't believe in a bodily resurrection because their thought was that material things were evil. So that means the body was evil. And so these guys were just a bunch of body shamers. They believed the spirit was good. And so they think, well, why would you clutter the spirit up with a body? Where they had no concept of a glorified body. But the truth is there is no good news without Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And that you can't know God without believing these things, believing in Jesus. And so there's a lot of these guys. What'd they do? They heard this and they mocked Paul. But then there were others of them, they wanted to hear more. But there was a few of them that actually believed and were saved. And one of them was one of these 12 council members, because he's named here, Dionysius, the Areopagite, who's named after that place where Paul's speaking. And then it mentions another woman, Damaris, who we know nothing about. And then it just says there was a few others. So Paul, he didn't have the big results that he had in Berea or Thessalonica. But we also don't hear of Paul being kicked out of town after speaking. But this response that Paul received here, it's actually not much different than the responses that we receive when we share Christ with non-believers, where people, they'll mock us because they'll think it's silly. They'll think there is no resurrection. They don't believe in the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. And then you got all these other kind of people. They're just procrastinators. They've heard it and they go, well, I don't want to really commit to this. I'm gonna wait. I'm listening. I hear what you're saying. Where they say they want to hear more, but usually those people, they've already heard enough to make a commitment. They're just putting it off. But then you have a few people who actually believed. And some people, they criticize Paul here because Paul didn't preach the cross. I have no criticism of Paul here. I believe that Paul is in a very hard room. These are very hard people to reach. But it is true when Paul, he goes to Corinth, because he speaks about it in his letters to the Corinthians, that all he speaks in Corinth is the cross. And that may be because of the small response that he got in Athens, where Paul, he tells us, he says that the cross is foolishness to the Gentiles that are perishing. But we'll see next week that it'll produce a lot of life in Corinth. So last week, we saw Paul in Athens, and he was speaking at the Areopagus, which is Mars Hills, by invitation, a place that he never dreamed he would have ever been able to speak at. And it's not just because it's the place where the greatest presentations of thought were discussed, because it was the greatest auditorium in the whole world where he got to present Jesus Christ before these influential men of Athens, where he didn't have big results. And though the people of Athens had an interest in hearing Paul, they thought they were too intelligent and too smart to believe what he said, where they were too well educated in their various philosophies, so they were unwilling to hear the truth. and being so entrenched in their idols that there was only a couple people who responded. So now Paul, he leaves the greatest city that he's ever been to so far, and he leaves it where this is the only city where he has not planted a church or he's appointed any elders. And so he's not leaving Athens on a high note, and he's probably feeling like a failure. And so now he travels 50 miles to the north to Corinth, where Athens, they had a population of 50,000 people, being a university town. But now Paul's going to a city that's 10 times bigger, with 200,000 Roman citizens and 500,000 Roman slaves. And so I would imagine that he's probably feeling like, why bother? Because if you can't make it in Athens, how are you ever going to make it here in Corinth? Where Corinth, it was a lot like Athens, it was just bigger. But they both served the same idols. They both had the same kind of philosophies with pagan temples everywhere. But Corinth, it didn't have a refined culture. Corinth was much nastier, where it made preaching in Athens like Paul was preaching in church. So why even try here? Where Corinth's main deity was Poseidon, but the deity that Corinth was really famous for was the goddess Aphrodite, who is also known as Venus, the goddess of the earth, where up on a plateau on this hillside overlooking 1,700 feet above the city of Corinth, they built a temple to this goddess Aphrodite, and where it was filled with 1,000 female prostitutes with other male prostitutes who would descend every night on the city, applying their trade with all their proceeds going to the temple, where most of these girls were bought at the slave market, and then they were donated to the temple by the wealthy patrons. So this is a lot like sex trafficking, but it's legal here, where it wasn't looked down upon at all, where these women were actually paid by the city of Corinth. And Corinth was a very wealthy city. And what made them so wealthy is that they had two harbors, where Corinth was an isthmus, which is this long, narrow peninsula, but it connects two land masses with water on both sides. Where on one side of Corinth was the Adriatic Sea, and on the other side, it was the Aegean Sea. So all trade and all travel, it all went through Corinth. Because going through the isthmus of Corinth, you only had to go like 3.5 miles, where it was only 3.5 miles wide. Where at one time, the Emperor Nero, he tried to build this canal from one side of Corinth to the other to connect the two seas, but he wasn't able to accomplish it. But that canal is there today, but it was only completed about 100 years ago. But what they did have in Paul's day is they had this paved road connecting the two seas. And so for smaller ships, they would unload them, and then they would tie them up with ropes, and they would drag that ship to the other sea, rolling it on top of logs. And with the larger ships, all they would do is they would just unload the cargo, and then they would take the cargo over that 3.5 miles to the ships on the other sea.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.